Hello, Jessica Knight, Research Communications Specialist here. In this video, one of our research office team members, Shannon Kasperson, gives a great overview of best practices for creating infographics. She covers a ton of useful tips and tricks and looks at some examples as well. So if you're thinking about submitting an infographic for Research Day, please watch and then check out the tools you have access to for creating your infographic. We have information about 3 different programs you can access called Venngage, Canva, and BioRender. And that's all on the Research Day website. And then once you've drafted your infographic, be sure to come to one of the drop-in sessions that we're hosting the week before the submission deadline, where you can get feedback on your infographic from research office and communications staff. So hope to see you there. Thanks.
So what is an infographic? I'm sure a lot of you have seen them. They're pretty popular now. A lot of different industries are using them, but it's essentially a graphic design that combines data and visualization elements to try and give the reader an easy to understand explanation. So I was a judge at last year's Research Day, and one of the themes we noticed is that while there was pretty good attempts to put it in lay language, it really is built into the rubric that the deliverable you're going to produce needs to be accessible to a lay person. I consider myself to be a layperson because science was my worst topic in school. And so I really struggle to understand sometimes the different things that my researchers are doing, but if it's put in lay language, I can understand it. So I wanted to make that clear when I say the easy to understand, that would be the expectation of the infographic that would be delivered. So why? Why this medium over others? Well, there's been a lot of research on this. The human brain can process images as quickly as 13 milliseconds. Not just processing the information, but the brain then continues to process it even after the image is no longer there. It's just a really strong way to get a person to continue thinking about what you've presented even after it's no longer in front of them. And there's been, I saw different studies on this with different statistics, but the one I saw the most is that when people are hearing the information spoken, they remember maybe about 10%. But versus when they're seeing it in an image, they retain about 65% up to 3 days later. I did see another study that said, I don't know if it was 3 days later or maybe immediately right after, but when they saw images presented, it was up to an 80% retention rate and memory versus the 10%. So a lot stronger when you're combining your information with visuals. It's a better way to tell and receive stories. And when I say better, for me, what I mean by that, it's better because the effectiveness of the visual can decrease the time it takes to learn, improve the comprehension, enhance the retrieval, and then increase the retention. So it depends on what you're trying to do, but it can be a better way to tell and receive stories. It also helps keep the audience interest by doing storytelling, which, again, as a non-scientist, I'm going to need to be captivated by what I'm hearing, or I'm just not going to get it and I'm going to zone out. And so if we can take what we're doing or what you all are doing and do it in more of a storytelling format, someone like me, it becomes accessible to them all of a sudden. And that's a game changer when you're trying to affect change. They take advantage of the visual processing research I just showed you with memory. They help give tangible points of reference, which we can do in written, but when you do it visually, it's a little more powerful. And I'll show some examples of that. But it's also something that can be read scanned easily. I have a friend who's always sending me YouTube videos, and I tell him if they're over 30 seconds, don't even bother. Like I'm not going to watch it. And I feel like that's more and more of what we're turning into, for better or worse. I mean, depending on the importance, if it's something super important, I'm not going to require 30 seconds, but just in general, the quicker, the better. But we also don't want to sacrifice quality in terms of speed. And so I think infographics can be a really good in between. This is something fun. I learned that even Abraham Lincoln loved them because this is an example of not an example, this is a map from 1861 that visualized the South. And it was said that he kept this map with him all the time because it was visualizing the politics across the states in the South using shades of gray, white, and black. It gave Lincoln a sense of which states he could expect to secede and which ones that there may still have been some hope for him to do some persuading to stay in the Union. So he was using it strategically with his advisors because it was easy to process complicated information quickly. You could see this in a snapshot and he was able to plan. So he's one of the originators. So this was another interesting research study I found that, the saying like a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, Alan Blackwell of University of Cambridge did this study that he had his subjects create different visuals to transmit information that they wanted to transmit. But then after that, he had each person describe the visual in words, and the average number of words needed to describe their image was 84.1 words. So really, I'm not trying to say, oh, just do an image and you can get rid of 84 words, but it does show the power that when we're trying to get information out there quickly and in a way that we know that someone is going to remember, a lot of times people are not going to scroll through a bunch of words. And if an image can have that same impact, then it behooves us to use it. So these are a couple examples that kind of help literally visualize what I'm talking about. So we like data visualizations because they tap into pattern recognition, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone who's communicated science before, or written a proposal trying to get someone to understand something that maybe they're not super familiar with, but it can significantly increase the comprehension. For here, we can see that figures tend to be better at that than maybe tables. And what I mean by that is, here is, what is this, population growth, I believe. This is an image line that you found. If we had just listed a table of states and numbers and alphabetized it, it wouldn't really have any bang. I don't know if we would really understand what we were seeing. There would be no trends. But when we do a visualization like this, it can quickly, in the blink of an eye, show the trend we're trying to show. And we want to highlight the significant information versus having something like Mike brought up earlier to me, maybe an ordered list, maybe would have had them in alphabetical order. That wouldn't really be helpful to me. I noticed a lot of this when I was looking at the COVID dashboards as well, when they were comparing states. Doing them in alphabetical order isn't super helpful. Organizing this way, I was able to see kind of where every state was at. So this is just a good example of when we talk about like pattern recognition. It's a lot easier if you can show it. These are some other images that could easily be transported onto an infographic. This really gets at context. And I really struggle with this. I do a lot of reporting for the research office, and sometimes I'll say, the College of Veterinary Medicine submitted 200 proposals in fiscal 20. So like, if I don't really know where that stands in comparison to fiscal 19, 21, 22, it doesn't really mean anything to the reader who's not in my world. And that's what that first box is. If you're just giving a number, this is number of global internet users. Yeah, 2.2 billion is a lot, but like, I don't really know what that means. If I don't know how many users there are in the world or how many people there even are in the world, like that number doesn't really mean much if I'm trying to make a point. Same thing with that middle graphic. You might go, okay, well, I'll visualize it. Well, this still isn't really that great of a visualization. You just put 2.2 billion on a bar chart. It still doesn't really show me like compared to what. Whereas that third image that we're looking at, this is where you're going to give that frame of reference point that a graphic can give you pretty instantaneously. This is showing how what 2.2 billion is compared to the population of the United States. It's kind of when someone says, so-and-so country, which is the size of Texas. You're giving a reference point that the reader is going to be familiar with so they can get in your world and understand what it is you're talking about. I actually like these two images paired together. This one gives the reference point of the individuals in the United States, but then the second gives me a point of reference for total people in the world. I actually like the second image slightly better because it helps me understand that, up to a little over a quarter of the world are internet users, which is significantly less than I would have thought. But I'm also not in that industry. And so this graphic is going to be able to bring me up to speed pretty quick. And I think it's pretty powerful when you have that context to show the scope of what you're actually talking about. So we're going to go through the three components of good infographic design. Again, we talked about this earlier. It's really about storytelling, but stories should have a pretty consistent formula. I think for someone like me who really likes structure, that helps me maybe take what could be a pretty artsy medium that stresses me out. And if I can put some structure to it, it feels a little less overwhelming. The three components would be the introduction or building the foundation to the topic you're presenting, the key message, and then the conclusion or the call to action that we're going to try and elicit from the audience. And that's going to be different for everyone depending on what you're trying to do. So introduction is what it sounds like. The beginning of your infographic is just introducing me to the topic. And I say me because I'm talking about myself as the audience. I may not really be super familiar. I'm going to use the infographic. We're going to dissect cardiac arrhythmias and racehorses. Didn't even know it was a thing before I started working here. Like I said, I worked in community college with veterans before this, so it was not on my radar. The first part of that infographic should explain to me what that is. What is a cardiac arrhythmia? Why do I need to care? What's already been done? I don't even really know what an arrhythmia is. And so you have to maybe even explain that much. But not only what is it, like, why should I care? Like, I didn't grow up on a farm. I didn't own horses. I'm not into racehorsing. Like, why should I care about what you're saying? And that sounds kind of callous, but the reality is you care about your stuff, but nobody else necessarily does, right? And so if the whole point of this is to get more and more people to see the need for your issue or to raise funds or to elicit a behavioral change, you have to be able to hook them and show them why they should find it interesting. What is it about that they should be caring about? So there have been a few other presentations in this series where Mike and Molly talked about thinking about the audience. I think that's super important, and I'll get into a little bit of that later. Why do we need this research? What question are you answering? There could be a lot of different ways you could go with cardiac arrhythmias and resources. So what is the actual research question? Narrow that down, keep it simple, stupid. Tell me what you're trying to say. What's in it for me? So it would be really great if we all just like cared about stuff, but we don't. Like, I'm just being honest. I don't think we really all care about everything we should. We would get totally overloaded. So when you're presenting, you're going to have to tap into the motivation of the person you're presenting to figure out they may need to know what's in it for them. The best example I have is in my own life. When I was in graduate school, I was doing post-secondary education in correctional settings, which is a fancy word for doing college programming in prison. And it's not funded by the government at this point. It used to be, but it's kind of grassroots efforts at this point. So my thesis was on like why this would be a compelling thing to invest money in. And if I went around telling people, if you have a 2-year degree, you're less likely to go back to prison. You have a 60% chance of going back to prison with no education intervention, whereas even just a 2-year degree reduces that to 13%. It's pretty compelling stuff, but why do I care? Right? I'm not in prison. My family member's not in prison. I don't work in a prison. Why would I really care about the betterment of that person? I wish you cared, but you maybe don't. I talked to a lot of maybe more conservative people on that spectrum trying to make this sale, essentially, of like why this was important. And so I had to tailor my message and research findings based on the audience. So instead of going with it reduces return to prison, I went to the return to prison means less taxpayer dollars funded towards that system. So whether or not you like it, you're paying for them to be in prison. So it behooves us to make them not go back. Oh, okay. Also, these people are being released to your community, so they're less likely to offend on you if they've been rehabilitated. So I had to change my messaging and not just make it be about the betterment of the individual receiving the education, but how that betterment was going to make the person I was talking to see what was in it for them. Once I could get that, it was really hard to argue against. We still don't fund it publicly, but the conversations went a lot better, I felt. So I had to really think about the audience depending on kind of who was in the room. But then we also look at what are the pieces that we would maybe need to include given the message that we need to include on the infographic, which we'll, again, get into a little more of. The second part of the structure would be, what's the key message? What's the aha? Like, what is your main points? You'll see in this box here, if they remember nothing else, this should be what they remember. So I would say make it super clear, clean, obvious, literally even draw a box around it like I did. That's what infographics are for. You're going to want to segment out some text to like make it in their face what it is you're trying to tell them. So it should be, again, single main point, key data, 2 or 3 supporting findings, but really no more than that, because then someone who isn't in this world is going to get lost. They're not going to really be able to follow multiple pieces. Call to action is the last. It's essentially the conclusion of your infographic. It's a wrap up, giving next steps, but really for me, what I like to see is like, what do you want me to do? Sometimes I get overwhelmed with too much messaging about like social issues or this or that. And I'm like, yes, I'm with you. I like see the issue. I totally get it. I'm like, what do I do now? I want to do something. What is it that you're trying to get me to do? Because if you just convince me that there's a thing that needs attention, but don't tell me what I as the audience need to be doing about it, whether it's further research or funding or making it like in a behavioral change, wearing a mask, whatever that may be, you have to make it very clear what you're trying to get across. Why are you communicating this? We're not just communicating for the sake of communicating. We're trying to elicit something to happen. And it's going to be different depending on who you're talking to and what your objective is, but make it very clear. What are you conceptualizing as would be a success if this were to happen? So these are the components that I think make a good infographic, but also others who we've gleaned information from. It engages the audience. It gives new and possibly even surprising information. I listened to a student talk about her breast cancer research, and she was telling me stuff that I found super interesting, and I don't know anything about how cancer travels or develops. And I'm I know what breast cancer is. I'm a woman. It's shoved down her throat. I hear about it all the time. But what she was telling me was something I've never heard before. And it made a topic that can get kind of old after a while hearing all the time revised and refreshing for me to hear. So I think she did a really good job. Make the visuals appealing and distinctive. Again, we're going to show some like concrete examples of that. Again, simple and focused message, quick and easy to read, and use incredible data sources. Now, I think for Research Day, a lot of people are going to have credible data sources because you're presenting your own research. But let's say you're making an infographic about a topic and you're using other sources of information. I cannot state the importance of this being credible. And I wanted to give an example. I don't know how many of you saw this image during the last 2.5, 3 years, but this was shared all over my Instagram from friends, social media, all the time, pretty early in the beginning. And it sounds great because I'm like a huge advocate of wearing masks and taking COVID seriously, but also it has since been debunked. And that was, I knew it had been debunked, that this image specifically and what it was communicating, but a lot of my friends were still sharing it, like really smart, educated, progressive people were sharing this all over the place. And it was very frustrating because it didn't, some issues I see with it is there's no citation on it. So if someone wanted to fact check me, they couldn't. And also if they did cite it, they'd see it had been debunked. A better example would be something like this. This is put out by a reputable source, the Minnesota Department of Health. You've got the information that they can contact the source at the bottom if they had questions, gave more context to the images, not just images, and you're supposed to draw your own conclusions. This is a much better example of a credible source. So if you're doing an infographic and you're using external sources other than your own data, please cite it and please make it credible, because I'm from Missouri, the show me state, right? Like, prove it to me. If you tell me something, I'm going to want to be able to fact check you. And so I think it's important just as a citizen to like be honest and upfront about what we do, especially when it has health ramifications, but especially as a scientist, it's super important to be able to do that. Then there's just the like graphic design elements of making this. So we know like the why and what we're doing and why it's important and how do we tailor our message, but how do I like actually, as someone who is not a graphic designer, make a product that someone's going to care about and be able to get through? Part of it is the content, but part of it is the packaging. So we want to make sure that it's not super cluttered with lots of text, figures, images, that you have variation in design elements. And we're going to, again, show an example. But I don't want to see an infographic that only has graphs. I don't want to see an infographic that only has pictures. I want to see maybe there's a graph, maybe there's a picture, maybe there's a pictogram, maybe there's large numbers that are supposed to signify a research finding. There needs to be some variety. Graphic elements should be aligned, make sure that everything is lining up. It looks sloppy if things are kind of lined up, but not really. There's also been some research that larger images tend to elicit a better memory response than smaller images. I think that's actually a research study that just came out in the last couple of months from Bar-Ilan University, that larger images were 1.5 times more likely to be committed to memory than smaller images. So in an infographic, I would rather see 1 or 2 really solid larger images than a bunch of little ones, because your brain has to work too hard to process all of the components of that image, that it reduces the retention. Then we look at colors. We do link on this presentation. We'll send out the U of M branded colors that you can specifically use. I think it's a personal call if you want to brand your infographic U of M. I think it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to present as a U of M person, I highly recommend branding it with those colors, because color can increase the brand recognition. I mean, think about, I was telling Mike, like Tiffany blue, that's Tiffany and Company. It's actually been coined the term Tiffany blue because we make that association pretty strongly, which again can help with memory recall. But if you're not trying to align strictly with U of M, I've got some other tips for colors. But also know that color elicits a better memory retention than black and white. Studies have shown that we remember more of an image when there's color and variation than black and white shades. So try and avoid black and white or grayscale if you can. And then there was another study about harmonious, and they call it disharmonious color schemes. Now, I got a degree in like sociology and business. I'm not a graphic designer by any means, but there are definitely color schemes or palettes that are easier for the eye to process, which will allow them to focus on the content that you're putting in there instead of trying to make sense of the contrasting colors. So these are some examples from this 2011 study where they found that people who, when they used a more harmonious color palette, they were able to focus their attention on the content. And so I would say, if you're trying to figure out what those schemes are, I would just do a Google search of harmonious color palettes, and you'll be able to tell pretty quickly which are good that I would recommend, which are bad. I'd say that's actually another thing I saw in some of the submissions from last year, is that some of the colors were just too contrasting that it was almost distracting. And so it's not something you'd necessarily think about. You're focused so much that you're communicating very complicated scientific information with pictures. That's hard enough. But the color scheme could take away from all that hard work you're doing if you're not using a good one, I guess. That's what I'm trying to say. We want some easy to understand data visualizations. I did see a study that said that graphs actually aren't as helpful. I'm not going to tell you not to use graphs. I think sometimes you actually need to, but try not to do a ton. There's other ones that are going to be a little better depending on what you're trying to communicate. You've got different things if you're comparing versus stating a simple fact. Try not to make them overly complex. Remember, you're presenting to someone like me in this competition who does not write scientific papers for a living, and when I do work with a faculty member on their grant proposals, I'm not looking at their science and seeing if I think it's legitimate. I'm making sure their margins are one, so I am not going to know necessarily what these images say if it's too complex. So you've got to be able to make them very simple and straightforward that I can quickly gather that. The colors and shading could also be important because you might be showing size or prevalence, and that can be shown by smaller to larger or lighter to darker or vice versa. So those are some techniques you can use when you're trying to do this visually. Labels and legends are good. Just try and make them pretty clear. And then just make sure they're necessary to the message. There was this infographic that we're gonna actually get to in the next slide that Mike and I spent some time revamping. And a lot of that was removing stuff that, like, while it was a good image and they did the homework of not having too much text, we also had to ask ourselves, is this image really even necessary? Like, it ended up making the infographic a little longer than we would have liked. So not just making things visual, but also asking, like, do I even really need this visual specifically? Really think about that. So now is where we're gonna put you in breakout rooms if we can figure it out, because we're not Zoom masters. Mike, do we think we can do it?
Yeah.
There is this infographic from last year, which we have permission of the researcher to tear apart today. So I promise we asked her first. But this was one that was submitted last year on cardiac arrhythmias and racehorses. And so I'm going to put the link to this infographic in the chat. So you all should be able, actually, I want someone to click on it and tell me if they're able to see it. It is public, but I just want to make sure. We're going to ask you to get in groups and talk about what you like about it and what you maybe don't like about it. And then we'll come back and talk. You will not open, page cannot be found. Well, then we're not going to do that. So, okay. I don't know if I'll be able to change the setting on the fly, Mike. So maybe we'll just talk about it as a group, if that's okay. So let me go back to it. Should be this one. So we're going to do the, like, throw it in the chat, if that's okay. Can you all see the infographic still, Mike? Does it look good?
Yeah.
Okay.
It looks good.
So I'm just going to scroll slowly, and I want someone, as I scroll, to maybe type in the chat something that they think looks good and something that maybe, given the information I've given so far, that you'd recommend a shift of. Mike, maybe you could monitor that for me.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're not going to jump into breakout rooms if those links aren't accessible for everybody.
Right.
So
that doesn't do us any good.
So go ahead, and if anything jumps out at you, please feel free to share your opinion in the chat.
And I'm going to be
Aaron, that's a good. Aaron says the colors might contrast a little too much.
Yep.
Somebody says you have to work hard to differentiate images of the heart. Up a little higher.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I see that.
Amy says the turquoise color on the left with the heart blends into the border, whereas the white box with the heart next to it pops out. Yep. It draws your attention to the white rather than.
Kind of the same thing here too. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Now this one.
Alex says she likes the large graphics and the headings, but there's a lot of small text.
Yes, indeed.
tend to agree on the text. Lauren, a couple people are talking about a lot of text.
So that was, as it stood, Mike and I, who are not experts in cardiac arrhythmias, but Mike
is too small.
Being able to take your information and make it more accessible, that's his job full time. We took a stab at recreating it, and we're going to show you side by side the changes that we made. Now, if I had all day, I probably would have done maybe even a little more, but I had to save my time knowing I had proposals to get out the door. So on the left is as it was submitted. On the right is what we came up with in maybe the 2 or 3 hours we met over 2 sessions to do this. One thing we did right away is we took out this. Too much text already. It's already 4 lines of text that I'm probably not going to read. I'm just being kind of blunt. So we took that out and changed the title, because if we could take some of this and stick it in the title, we're able to quicker tell someone what this is about versus a more broad title and then having to tell them in a mini paragraph. So that was our first change. Our second change was we took out all the sub explanations under the sub heading titles. So we already had these different sections, which I really liked. It helped segment and take my brain through this sequential message, but it was too many layers of like, read this, then this, then this. So we took this out and again, made these a little more clear of what maybe this was trying to say. And I should also say, before I ever gave this to anybody, I would have the researcher make sure I did not mess up any of the integrity of what they were trying to say. That is part of what Mike does when he works with people. When he is writing up stuff on your research, it's going back and forth to make sure that the researcher, that we didn't lose any of that. So that did not happen on this. And the researcher knows that this is just being used for today's presentation. It's not going anywhere. We did keep the graphics, mostly because that's a really good point. I didn't even really think on that. I thought I couldn't distinguish between the hearts because I'm dumb. I really thought that. So, but maybe there really is something that a better image could have been used. We shortened this text quite a bit and made it less sciencey. Attempt to replace the jargon with lay language and reduce it by about half. There's a good rule of thumb in marketing that you write something and then you cut it in half when you're done writing. And that's not always possible, but that is a good thing to strive for. Get what you want down and then see if you can cut it in half. And
in just to add in reducing some of the text on this infographic, we didn't always replace the language with something we thought would really get to the heart of it, but just be shorter. If we didn't feel comfortable doing that, we just made the suggestion. So sometimes you'll see where we actually edited it, pared it down as much as we could by half or more. Sometimes we just said, we suggest that this be pared down, but we don't know exactly how to say it given the science.
Yeah. And even here, the heart is made up of 4 chambers, right? We just put the 4 chambers of the heart, a little bigger, not as much text in a paragraph. It's just easier for the brain to move through. We really liked this image. I thought that was maybe not an actual ECG, right? But it's still giving the reader an idea of what we're talking about. Anyone who's had to have a stress test would probably have seen this image before. So then we moved to the second section. Again, we took out these subheadings. Actually on this one, Mike, we did keep it because we thought it was important, but we didn't include it in the black. We made it its own introduction to these pictures. And I actually really liked this section. I thought this was a good example of using images and less text to do a compare and contrast, especially when you've got that versus. You're clearly showing what you're trying to compare. And I thought that section was really well done. We didn't make any changes there other than
I do like some of the, forgive me for interrupting. I do like some of the feedback that we got there on the colors. That's one thing I hadn't really considered as much, but I do tend to agree that the colors might not have, the background color didn't help make the foreground pop as much.
Right. So this one, I think this is when it got a little tougher for us, Mike, from what I remember. Again, we reduced this. There were 4 images and 2 of these. And again, we had to ask ourselves, like, are all these images necessarily telling a story that needs to be told? A picture of a horse is maybe not necessarily needed for this, given maybe something else, or maybe it can be used in a different way. And so we took this text here and turned them into a single number with the visual paired with it. So instead of it being embedded in text, it's now clear. We did keep these images, but we felt that we were having trouble figuring out how this should read. Do we go down this column and then back up here and down, or are we going to read it more left to right, like lines? And so we took the method of taking the information and going left to right with it instead of top down, move to the next column, top down. It felt like it flowed a little more vertically, which the infographic is vertical, so that made sense. Again, with some of these statistics that are embedded, we just made them larger and easier to grasp quickly. Again, less text. I even think, Mike, we could have gotten away with taking out that image, but you know, we do our best, I guess. I should also say that we're being really harsh on this infographic, so I apologize, Sean, if you're out there. It was a good one to use because there were things that I definitely think she did right. But this one, in my opinion, should have been 2 separate infographics. It felt like a CVS receipt. It was super, super long, and we just had to like keep scrolling and keep scrolling. So we would have somehow, I'm not sure how it would have been broken up into 2, but it's definitely longer than I think we'll want to see most people turning in for the competition. Again, we changed the heading. Some of the words we really couldn't strictly take out and put in the heading, but we just made it separate. This felt like too much. We definitely liked her image use here, but this is where we got to a little too much text right there. That's definitely too much for an infographic. So we tried to pare it down, do a bigger font. We probably could have even bolded some stuff in here to draw even more attention quicker than having to read that paragraph. Make sure we're citing our sources. And then we took some of that data and made it, again, where we're now doing a bulleted list, which the brain can comprehend a lot quicker. That was one of the things I learned with my veterans. I was writing these newsletters of all this information. They're like, give us a bullet pointed list, lady. So I started just making lists, and then they were like, got it, thanks. I'll go carry out the task. So we pared this down, still included some images because we wanted to make it pop. Could have even done without them, but why identify? And again, we're saying why. We're telling people like, why does this matter? We don't want to embed it in some text. I'm trying to make it really clear to the reader why this is important. And I thought something she did really well was explicitly stated the long-term goal and bolded it. It wasn't hidden in a bunch of text. If anything, I didn't think it was showcased enough. So we made it its own, separate with a different colored background, separate from this information. We wanted it to stand out even more. We're almost done. So this one probably required the most work. And I'm sure Sean was just like tired by the end of this infographic and was like, I got to just get this stuff down. But this is a lot of text and also a typo there. You don't want this on infographic. This screams scientific poster, not infographic. So we were able to find some key numbers and do a number display here. Again, it's all the content was here. Luckily, there was stuff we could use that made it easy to change this over. But again, we've got that goal. We wanted it highlighted. What we're doing, we tried to make a list. And then what we want to learn. And I do like that she specifically had outcomes and impacts. That's supposed to be that call to action of like, this is what we hope to do. I would have liked to say, maybe see something, what you want me to do, possibly, if that's, part of it, but it was trying to synthesize exactly where they left off with that research. Mike, is there anything I missed?
No, you hit it all really well. I think Erin made a good point in some of her feedback that the outcomes and impacts is a little too small. And that's another thing I tend to agree with. It's kind of it almost feels like a little bit of an afterthought.
Yeah. And we took this out too, because again, it was like, are the images creating value? Not really, not there. They were already at the top. I don't really think they created value.
Albert
nice attempt at trying to, on the fly, take something someone else did without being experts in cardiac arrhythmias and making it more accessible. I would never send that to somebody if, I would never send that out without running it past the individual to make sure that we didn't lose any of that.